So here we go. Episode 2.
Yep.
Sense and Sensibility. I've got pages 135 to 201, which takes us kind of all the way through the rest of Volume 2 and a little ways into Volume 3.
Yeah, we started with Chapter 8 of Volume 2,
Right.
finished that, and then read the first 3 chapters of Volume 3.
Correct. So I think I was thinking to myself. So as you know, I finished up my reading kind of a little bit at the last minute,
Yeah.
and had about 40 or so pages to read last night. Good, it's a good chunk, but nothing. There's not a lot of backbreaking reading
No.
in this.
No.
But I was going to say, just as a way to maybe get us started, I was going to say, if you had asked me this time yesterday, not having read those last pages, I would have gone like, not a whole lot happened
Right.
this time.
Right.
But I feel like the last 20, 30 pages of today's reading really kind of opened up a whole new can of worms, if you're allowed to use that phrase while talking about Jane Austen.
Well, the Volume 3 opened explosively. With the cat gets out of the bag, to use another cliche,
right.
with Edward Ferrars and Lucy, and that leads to all kinds of consternation, and then Eleanor having to massage things and work against her own feelings.
As always.
Yeah, so that definitely, before that, I think what we had seen, you're right, not a terrible lot happened, other than just, we were watching, Marianne in her sort of sleepwalky state, and Eleanor trying to sort of revive her, Mrs. Jennings being very attentive, like the beginning was still in the aftermath, Marianne recovering, and then, if I'm remembering right, Volume 2, well, it kind of closed out with before we got to the explosive stuff about Lucy and Ferrars, Eleanor had run into Robert Ferrars.
Right.
Like, first she ran into him at the jewelry store, and Austen very snarky about how, what was it, like a
toothpick case.
And he was being
bejeweled, bedazzled toothpick.
And just, when they run into each other at that party, he's just so officious. It left this, it was like page 178 of my edition, when he's like, oh, I love cottages. And it's one of those things where, you're completely following what's trendy. And this happens all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, somehow you frame it as if, like, you're out here alone arguing for it. Mm-hmm. Even though, like, it's what everyone's into, right? Like,
and then on top of it, right, his idea of a cottage is this luxurious, 7-bedroom house with 9 servants.
And I mean, he says, like, at the top 178, I advise everybody who's going to build a cottage. My friend Lord Courtland came to me the other day on purpose to ask my advice and laid before me 3 different plans of Bonamy's. I was to decide on the best of them. My dear Courtland, said I, immediately throwing them all into the fire. Like, he thinks that this, whether hyperbole or not, makes him look good.
Right.
But, like, what an asshole thing to do, like, if he did it.
Hey, I just paid for them.
Yeah. And then, a little bit further down, he's like, talking about Lady Elliot wished to give a dance, but how can it be done, said she, my dear Ferrars, do tell me how it is to be made. It's like, Eleanor's eyes are about to just fall out of her head, they're rolling so hard.
Well, this is, so I have a used copy of the book, of course, and I actually made a note to show you that whoever owned this book before me, at the very end of that passage, wrote in tiny little fussy script, mansplaining.
He is mansplaining. And then you get the standalone paragraph. Eleanor agreed to it all, for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. And I think that goes with the mansplaining. I think that a lot of women, when you talk to women in academia or in business or in the service industry, whatever, it's like a go-to move to just be like, you know what? Go ahead and say whatever. I'm not even going to dignify this by saying that you're being a jerk,
It's
you know?
also, I think, and I can't decide, I think that what I'm about to say is something that kind of goes without saying for anybody who's familiar with Austen, but as somebody who's kind of like returning after a long time away from Austen, I feel like I'm sort of rediscovering, or maybe even just for the first time discovering some things that young me really just glossed over in his innocence and ignorance. But it is also just typical of Eleanor, this silence and restraint, this adherence to duty, which is often to be quiet about something. So I think there's some great little digs. I think what we do see a fair bit of in today's reading is Austen as kind of sort of satirist of this particular society, and this is certainly a moment of that. But I think also underneath that, I'm feeling like there's a layer of really important kind of illustration of sort of what this world really called for. That this is a world where the stakes, even for something trivial, are incredibly high, and the punishment for a misstep incredibly high. And so Eleanor, as our avatar of sense, I think correctly, just often decides to be quiet, and it's an interesting
and I mean, there was one more thing I wanted to say about Ferrars, because I don't think that's I think there's stuff we want to talk about that's much more important than Robert, but Robert and Edward even. But just one of the things I hope we remember to get back to is that crushing dialogue between Eleanor and Marianne, where Eleanor is laying out for Marianne everything that happened, and Marianne is like, "Oh my God, I was so horrible to you." There's like this kind of like scales from the eyes kind of moment. Where they have like real communication, and then Marianne becomes like super defensive of Eleanor and starts getting really mad at the way, like you say, the people in the society are treating and cavalierly. But for the first time, we see Marianne kind of adopting some sense, because she learns to be quiet.
Well, she's promised Eleanor, right, and it's that added element of duty to her sister that allows her to kind of go, she never felt this obligation to society, but she feels this obligation to her sister. And I think that's a kind of, very Elizabeth Barrett Browning kind of moment, but also I think really important in terms of, last time I was talking about my sense of the economics in this, and this is absolutely just a question of valuation. That Marianne values Eleanor. Like more than all these other jerks.
Right.
And that's why she's able to do this thing. Like, she never cared enough about them to behave, but she cares enough about Eleanor.
Right.
So I think it's really interesting.
Then there's a moment, because we're working with the Norton, something kind of made my eyes pop almost at the very end of the reading. A comment by Claudia L. Johnson. It comes on page 199 when Eleanor's having this kind of decisive talk with Colonel Brandon, and we got to emphasize, we're still not at the point yet where we're sure which men are despicable and which men are wonderful. But I think the die is kind of cast that Brandon's at least okay. And that Edward Ferrars, for all his faults, is at least okay. They might turn out to be even better, but it seems like those guys, like, they're starting to look like they're not deceiving users anyway. And at the bottom, Brandon is talking about Ferrars, and he says, "I've heard," he said, "he, with great compassion, of the injustice your friend Mr. Ferrars has suffered from his family, for if I understand the matter right, he has been entirely cast off by them for persevering his engagement with a very deserving young woman. Have I been rightly..." First of all, he's very good at talking. Eleanor appreciates this. Like, he basically just sums up about 40 pages of novel.
Right.
In like, I wish my students had that level of summary skills. "Have I been rightly informed?" Eleanor told him it was so. "The cruelty, the impolitic cruelty," he replied, this I think speaks to your point about stakes, "with great feeling, of dividing or attempting to divide two young people long attached to each other is terrible. Mrs. Ferrars does not know what she may be doing. what she may drive her son to. I have seen Mr. Ferrars 2 or 3 times in Harley Street and am much pleased with him. There's a little asterisk.
Yeah.
And when you go to the bottom, Johnson writes, and the asterisk is next to the name Ferrars, Mr. Ferrars. And Johnson writes, in version A of this book, the first edition that was published, Austen had specifically spelled out Mr. Edward Ferrars there. And the reason Johnson gives is Austen evidently did not want to call attention at this point to the possibility of mistaking one Ferrars for the other. And that made me go, is there some like thing about to happen that's going to pull the rug out from under us? I mean, I don't know how much of a spoiler that is, but like, are we... I mean, I don't know. It can't be Robert that Lucy's engaged to, because Lucy was in the room with Edward. I mean, I don't think it's that we're confusing, but there's something...
Well, I also noticed that footnote, and not to sort of belabor the point, but I think that what that made me think about was the way that, and we see this just in that section that you just read, right, where Colonel Brandon says, have I been rightly informed?
Yeah.
In a way, this makes him the most sensible guy in the book.
Yeah.
Because if people just asked that question a little bit more, a lot of this stuff wouldn't.
Well, so it is in our world today.
Well, right.
I'm
thinking about the way like Lord Middleton, Sir Middleton,
right, Sir John,
yeah, the way that Sir John, does that like winky, jokey, like, oh, you're about to be married. If this were a guy whose impulse was to kind of pause and go, have I been rightly informed about that? This would have saved a lot of headache early on. And so because the stakes are so high in this world, there's a lot of kind of off the books talking, right? And this seems to be the cause of problems more than the solutions of them. And so I'm thinking there must be some moment later where the formality of Mr. Ferrars is going to create some confusion about who's talking about whom.
And there's so much doubling anyway. When you... I figured out about, embarrassingly late in the novel, I figured out that usually when Austen writes Miss Steele, she means the older sister.
Right.
Like Anne or Nancy? I can't remember.
Lucy.
Lucy's the younger sister.
Right, Lucy's the younger sister, and I think Anne and Nancy, and I'm
they're the same.
Well, I was going to say I'm hesitating to admit this on the record.
Yeah.
I think that Anne is Nancy, and some people call her Anne. And some
yes.
people call her Nancy.
Okay, so there's that doubling.
Right.
But then, so if she says Miss Steele, she means Anne/Nancy. Right. If she says Lucy, then she means Lucy.
Right.
So,
who is also Miss Steele.
Who is also Miss Steele.
Contexts.
And sometimes they will call her Miss Steele.
They're the Miss Steeles.
Yeah, so that keeps you guessing. Right. And then, of course, the Eleanor Marion double is at the center of things.
Right.
You've got the Robert and Edward doubling now.
Ferrars brothers.
And then all of that is not even, withstanding like the other... There's another pair of sisters. Yeah,
Palmer's match with the Dashwoods.
Yeah,
with her brother. And Fanny.
Yeah,
there's this kind of mirroring.
And then it's important to remember that Mrs. Dashwood is Robert and Edward's sister.
Right.
What a wild progeny that is, just based on what we've learned about. I mean, Mrs. Dashwood is a fucking horrible person, right? And
wait, you're talking about Mrs. Ferrars?
Well, no, John Dashwood's
Fanny Dashwood. Yeah.
She's terrible.
Yeah.
And Eleanor's like, kind of cold-blooded about it. She's like, well, I don't care how miserable they all are. I feel a little bit bad for Lucy. Mm-hmm. I feel a lot bad for Edward. But like the rest of them can go suck a lemon, Eleanor's pretty clear that she doesn't think that their comfort is worth. And the brother, like pleading brokenness to her, that was Austen, again satirizing that type of person. It's like not only did he hang her out to dry against his father's wishes, but he's like rubbing it in her face, and go ahead.
Well, not only pleading brokenness, right? But she gives her this moment to demonstrate how exactly informed she is when he's sort of talking about how if only I had a little more cash. He's talking about how expensive it is to live in the city.
Yeah.
And how grateful he was that Mrs. Ferrars gave them some cash when they arrived.
Right.
Which seems a little weird to be
it's like a couple £100 or something.
To be this like grown married couple, we have dinner with my in-laws every once in a while, and sometimes it's something like pizza, and we'll just pick it up on the way. And my father-in-law is not extraordinarily fussy and informal, but he has this thing about obligation, financial obligation, and so like he will get online and look up the exact price and like pay his part of the pizza. He's not
comfortable with you and Suzanne just buying it,
right? And I'm trying to explain to him, like in some ways, like figuring out what to do with like the 36 cents and change that came with this is actually more of a hassle to me than just buying them some pizza once in a while. I mean, this is not gourmet pizza.
Right.
But so there's this kind of I guess this sense of obligation is what kind of like that the John, that the brother gets this money from his mother-in-law, and it's just like, oh, well, that's how it should be. It just seems really weird to me. But then in that same conversation, he mentions how like they've had these expenses, and Eleanor kind of lays in a little and says, but I thought you were enclosing, this comment.
Yeah.
Which, as you know, is this huge, hotly contested kind of moral and political, question of the day, and so here he is, he's this villain, right, stealing the commons from the small-time farmers,
and complaining about it,
and saying like, oh, but it costs so much to fence everybody out of this land.
Yes,
and she's like, well, I would think that you would make a lot of money once you did that, and he's like, oh, well, but you don't understand, when clearly she knows exactly what
she does understand. And I mean, further, the business with the Steeles, like when John Dashwood asks Fanny to have his sisters, he's like, it just won't look good if they spend the whole time here in London and we don't have them over at all. And Fanny gradually talks him down.
Again.
Just like with the money, which was a fantastic scene. I don't know if we put enough attention on how hot that was, like that dialogue where they went from, like, he's going to make it right for them, to her sort of walking him to the point where it's like nothing. Yeah. And then here it's like, well, I just got it in my mind to invite the Miss Steeles. Yeah. So her own pettiness, in some ways, precipitated the trauma that she experienced, if trauma it be that your brother is going to marry someone you didn't pick. Like, first of all, eye roll. But in 1811, maybe. Maybe this is legit trauma for her. But if she had just, like, let the Dashwoods come, Mm-hmm. And she was so horrible to Eleanor and petted Lucy so officiously, when they all had that dinner together, that it all just blew up in her face, in a way that I think Austen finds satisfying, even if Eleanor can't allow herself to be satisfied.
I think this is a really interesting element of this, right? That so much of what seems to be driving people on the Ferrar side is this defense against Eleanor. Yeah. Right?
Because Eleanor's broke.
Well, right. And it's nice to Lucy because she's not Eleanor.
Right.
Right. And of course Lucy doesn't get it because she's this kind of
she's not that smart, right?
Yeah. But it's just really interesting to me that I feel so conflicted because on the one hand, right, they're terrible people, right, and I think Eleanor is making no bones.
Right.
She thinks that they're superficial. She thinks that they're. One of the things I want to swing back to is that parlor scene when they're preferring Lucy to Eleanor.
Right.
And the narration about this disagreement over which kid is tallest is just fantastic.
Marianne.
Just fantastic.
Marianne once again steals the scene when she's like, well, I just never thought about it. And now they're all mad,
Right. But this, this thing is also complicated for me by the realization that the stakes for these things are very real, and this is sort of, in a way, the one little bit of control that these women have. It's weird. I feel like I'm not making a lot of sense here, but on the one hand, we see this world that is dominated. I think we mentioned this last week. Dominated by these like rich widows. You know, they are. I think of them as these kind of like social death stars, just kind of floating in the sky, like threatening, always threatening to cut off their sons.
Yeah.
Very kind of Freudian, fraught kind of thing.
Which, by the way, makes Mrs. Jennings a much more sympathetic character than I think I realized last
she's
time.
Much more likable, and
like it's not like Austen. Yeah, it's not like Austen saying, "Look how refined she is." Of course, she's not. She's a good person, and Eleanor knows this. Marianne even knows. Even when Marianne's like, "Oh, I can't take it."
Right.
What she can't take is very human, right? Like when you're hurting, sometimes that person who's super nice. You're like, oh, stop pitying me, stop it. But Jennings's motives are always like kind of on the money in Austen's moral universe. But you're right, she's the only widow who's that way.
And if you'll notice, her finances are different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That Ferrars and Willoughby have estates.
Yeah.
And Jennings has a jointure.
Yeah.
Right? And I think there must be some distinguishing factor there that were I to really do a deep dive here, I think that economic model would kind of demonstrate. My understanding is that basically she can't pass that on.
Yeah.
And so she's allowed to be a decent human being because she's not entrusted with this great fortune that then she has to sort of, properly arrange a future for. But which kind of gets me to the other point. Like on the one hand, we have these, battle axes kind of like floating around, ruining things for all the young lovers.
Yeah.
Right? In this kind of Shakespearean way. But at the same time, this is a genuine responsibility that these women have, and the stakes are real, and in the business of this side of things, I guess maybe not unreasonable for Mrs. Ferrars to say no. That's not where the money's going.
Well, maybe, and I find it interesting how little we know Edward at this point in the novel. Like, on the one hand, he's a very dominant figure, but he's only showed up a couple times, right? Like, he visited them. The rest of it is either the narrator or Eleanor or people talking about him.
Yeah.
And, he did visit them in Devonshire, and he was obviously distracted, and Eleanor was like, I wonder what's up with him. Then he visits them at Jennings' house at the same time that Lucy is there. Which is that scene was in this week's reading, and that was kind of weird.
Yeah.
And Marianne was like, "Why doesn't she leave?"
And the moment when they open the door, and it's like a Three's Company.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I wrote Three's Company in here.
They open the door, and he's there's I forget the line, but it seems like he almost turns around and just leaves.
Yeah, he's like, and then and the narrator pops in and says, Lucy wouldn't have left had he stayed there for 2 hours, So we see him then. But the rest of the time, it's Mrs. Ferrars and Mrs. John Dashwood trying to dominate him financially. It's Lucy and Eleanor, both, and Eleanor would probably hate this, although she would agree with it. It's those two young women, meanwhile, are doing the emotional labor for the reader, is what I want to say, to make us like him. Like Lucy and Eleanor there's nothing he's done yet that the reader's going to go, oh, that Edward, But because Lucy and Eleanor think so highly of him, and neither of them seem to care if he has the money or not. Lucy seems very happy to just marry him and be broke. And you get the impression that Eleanor's kind of like, well, if I had to do it, without the money, like I'm already living in a little house, like whatever. Right. So they're doing the labor, and I wonder if that isn't part of the female dominant aspect of the book too. I mean, I remember from Pride and Prejudice that like Darcy is a much stronger character, more willful. He's going to have more things to say. But like these men, I mean, Brandon finally showed some like, well, I'll give him accuracy.
Right.
I'm choosing something, right? And we need to talk about the heartbreaking story of his his ex-girlfriend, his brother's wife.
That's my first note.
But
yeah.
I'll just kind of close this by saying, not only are the battle axes, as you say, policing the social side of things, but on a meta-narrative level, Eleanor and Lucy and Marianne, to a certain extent, are kind of responsible for the reader's feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you will like this guy, you won't like that guy, because the guys themselves aren't doing much to show you whether you should or not.
Well, I want to circle back to that, because I think you're right, but I think there are also these sort of exceptions that prove the rule.
Yeah.
And Colonel Brandon has really come up in my esteem in this week's reading.
Yeah.
And it's right on the cusp of 48 and 49, 148, 149.
Mm-hmm.
No, sorry, 149, 150.
Okay.
Like right at the bottom in my edition.
Yeah.
When Brandon, so after Willoughby has broken Marianne's heart, the news has come out about him marrying. Is not Miss
Grey.
Grey, right? I was going to say Morton, but that's the one.
Morton's the one they want for Edward.
For Edward, yeah. But Willoughby has broken Marianne's heart over Miss Grey, and Brandon reveals this truth to Eleanor
about Willoughby,
right? That he felt like he had to keep quiet when there was a chance that he was going to marry Marianne, which is interesting, right? Because this is a feminine behavior in my understanding. In the context of this book, this is like keeping quiet is a feminine behavior. And so he's showing this kind of discernment that is not, meanwhile Sir John is like,
right.
constantly.
And Willoughby's the same way.
Right.
You just talk about whatever.
Them,
yeah.
Right? But here's Brandon with this reserve, right? And I don't know quite what to make about that, but there's this great little bit of stuff, right? So we find out the story, right? That this so-called natural child of his is in fact his sister's.
His brother, his sister-in-law.
His sister, yeah.
Like let's walk through the story a little bit. Like he was in love with this woman, but his mother also dominated he and his brother and said, "No, you can't marry her. Your brother's going to marry her." Right? And then the brother does marry her, and then he's beastly to her. He neglects her.
Right.
You get the impression he was philandering too.
Right.
So she cheated on him.
With Willoughby.
No, I don't think it's the sister-in-law that cheated with Willoughby. I think it's the frickin' daughter.
That's what it was. Yeah.
But the sister-in-law cheated with someone.
Right.
And ended up getting a divorce, which Parliament has to do.
Yeah, right.
And ends up kind of like that fallen maid poem that you teach, the ruined maid that you teach sometimes. And he loses touch. He doesn't know what became of her. He finally tracks her down, and she's in a flop house dying of tuberculosis or something, and he promises to take care of the child.
Which is, that one is...
And then the child does the same thing the mother did. She has sex out of the context of marriage, and that was with Willoughby. And now she's pregnant, and he's got her laid up somewhere.
Right, but is otherwise... Like Brandon has taken care of her.
Yes.
Willoughby has disavowed the whole thing.
Right. And I guess, I'll just observe here that while it's certainly the case that, women and sex are treated differently, women who have sex are treated differently than men who have sex, especially outside the context of marriage, even in the world today, right? My gosh, it is kind of infuriating to look at this world where, the punishment for sex outside of marriage is the author will frickin' kill you. Right. There's no way that Eliza can stray from her husband and then be okay socially and economically. She's got to end up in the poorhouse, sick and dying, and now her daughter kind of irredeemable too. Right. And that's an infuriating plot necessity, I think. But anyway, you were noticing things about Brandon here. He's telling a story.
But what stands out to me, right? So Brandon relates all of this, and again, he waits, which I think is worth noting. But he relates all this to Eleanor, in effect, to give her reason to feel good about this, jilting of Marianne, if that's a fair thing to call it. And we realize, and I don't think I quite understood this until right here at the end of 149, that that this is kind of happening in real time. That this is why this business with Eliza, with his niece, is the reason he had to leave Barton Cottage back in Volume 1.
That's right. He says that.
About the same time that Willoughby left.
Yes.
Right? And it's all because of this nonsense. And Eleanor says, well, have you seen him since? And there's this kind of like profound moment, right?
I challenged him to a duel.
I could meet him in no other way, right? Eliza had confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, which was within a fortnight after myself, we met by appointment. He to defend, I to punish his conduct. They had a duel, and I think this is very Chekhov. This is very Cherry Orchard. I think that in a way, the most action-packed sequence yet, right, in the book, and it happens entirely off stage. It's entirely silent. Neither of them are wounded, right? They have this potentially bloody affair of honor, right? And it all happens in this very limited bit of gossip that is never repeated. And I just think it's really interesting. So here's Colonel Barton, and for the record, I think duels are these great narrative devices. I don't think you can build an actually functioning society around them.
Yeah.
But here's Colonel Barton, or Colonel Brandon. Sorry, Spartan Cottage. Here's Colonel Brandon. I think doing the right that is afforded him in this society. I think. Like Eliza,
even though it's illegal,
right?
You still can do it.
Well, and I think not only can, must in some cases. Yeah. And so here he is, the man who behaves the most like Eliza, right? He's reticent, he's careful, he knows the stakes.
You mean Eleanor?
Or sorry, yeah. He's doing all of this kind of responsible older sibling stuff. All the way to the point of literally putting his life on the line. To kind of perform this proper social office, right? Which I think we're supposed to here towards the end of Volume 2. I think we're supposed to start tilting his direction a little and saying okay, so here's a guy who's seen some things.
Yeah.
He's kind of
he's traveled the world.
He's kind of walked the walk.
Yeah.
And if he's a little quiet about it, maybe we should understand that. You ask this guy to tell some stories, maybe you hear some things that aren't exactly comfortable in the parlor.
And especially to tell a woman,
right,
which shows a certain estimation, let's say, of Eleanor.
I think
that he believes that he sees that both the Dashwoods are quality ladies. Right. He sees that right away, and it's about more than them being pretty. Right. There's something else.
There's this kind of human, like something. Now, this doesn't entirely get him off the hook for me in terms of chasing after Marianne.
Right.
But we see in him this kind of attention to duty, this sacrifice for duty that I think we only also see in Eleanor.
I think it was also interesting though, right after that part you quoted, we returned unwounded and the meeting therefore never got abroad, and then a standalone paragraph. Eleanor sighed over the fancied necessity of this, but to a man and a soldier, she presumed not to censor it. I think that right there is exactly what you were just talking about. She's like, oh, you men and your stupid penis measuring. But she's acknowledging what you just said. This is a guy that's been through it. So I'm gonna look kind of bad if I judge this verbally. So it's kind of just sighing. She's almost sighing at just the way of the world and what men have to do sometimes. She doesn't like it, but she knows that it wouldn't quite be cool for her to wag her finger at him about it.
I mean, I think she's right.
Yeah.
For the record.
Yeah.
But I also think she is correct to refrain.
Yeah.
Because I think what she's doing here, and what he's doing at the same time, is acknowledging there's this common humanity, but also they're acknowledging in their silence that these are sort of separate worlds there's that story about like Elvis going to see LBJ in the White House,
right?
And he's got the white cape and the whole thing,
yeah.
And it's Nixon?
Okay.
He's got the white cape and everything, and Nixon looks up and says something like, "That's quite an outfit you got on, son." And Elvis says something like, "Look, you got your show to run, I got mine."
Yeah.
And I feel like this is sort of what's happening here is that they recognize that they are in these interconnected but not identical worlds with super high stakes rules that must be obeyed, but they're not the same rules.
Yeah.
And I think both of them are trying to sort of bridge this gap in some human way while also refraining from pretending like they understand fully the other's experience. And I think it's a really touching moment. And then fast forward to the end of today's reading where he's offering this courtesy to
Edward.
And
allowing Eleanor to be the emissary of it. Yeah.
I think suggests this kind of very unusual level of understanding of the interconnectedness of all of this. That he's delicate, but he's also kind of like making moves.
Yeah.
That are functional in this world that Eleanor occupies. And I think this is a really interesting, I don't know that I love this guy, but he is showing a deft hand. I mean, it's a little like David Mamet, kind of.
Not only is he showing a deft hand, but for the most part, and I agree, chasing after the 16-year-old when you're 45. Although I don't know,
37.
37.
Yeah.
I don't know if by Austin's
now
go get it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that in Austin's moral universe we were supposed to be as judgy of that as we are. So I just don't know. I think you would have to do some more research.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the paratextual articles even talks about that. I haven't looked.
I'm just saying I'm refraining from some judgment
Sure.
there, not because I'm okay with it, but because I think that what's happening here is something a little bit different.
But that notwithstanding, the moves he's making show a deft hand, but he's also trying in his own way to make some things right.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to make Marianne and Eleanor right in terms of what Willoughby did to Marianne. He wants them to know that really you guys dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
He also wants here to, it's not like he can do that much for Edward, but he's the first person of substance to step forward and be like, listen, man, I will do something,
well, I think you're right, but I will add to that too. Mrs. Jennings has said,
she's like, I'll give you servants.
Come live with me.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I'll be happy to feed you.
You guys can get married and stay here.
Yeah. And who knows how that it felt a little like a heat of the moment kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I suspect she would live up. If he had shown up the next day, like I heard.
Yeah.
I suspect she would have lived up to it. But the other thing that I think is interesting, and I don't mean to make this all about Colonel Brandon, but I want to add one last thing. When we get to that section at the end of today's reading, like around 199, the way the narrator handles this, right? We see the scene twice.
Right. That was also very Three's Company.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the first time we see it, right? And again, we're in this world that's like so fraught and so full of the possibility of misunderstanding. And this is just another example that and it's that formality. And I guess this kind of comes back to the which Mr. Farrar show.
Yeah.
From the outside, it looks like he's proposing to Eleanor.
Right.
Right. And there's all this kind of like overheard and like people who are like eavesdropping and there was the great scene where Anne admits that she's been eavesdropping on her sister.
And Eleanor's like, oh my God, you shouldn't have told me any of this.
Right, I wish I had known.
Yeah.
But then we have this scene where people are like trying not to eavesdrop, but then like the piano stops playing for a second and they hear a word.
Yeah.
And I think this is really interesting that at the same time that I think Colonel Brandon is genuinely trying to kind of bring a moral order to this, which is, in a way, he's a version of these rich widows.
Yeah.
Right? Except he's trying to bring a moral order while they're trying to bring some kind of, financial order.
Yeah.
Or social.
Yeah.
But even as he's trying to do this thing that I feel like we're supposed to get behind, and which I don't have a hard time getting behind, sort of rewarding good behavior. Right?
Yeah.
That to the extent that he can, even as he's doing that, he's creating all this additional sort of misapprehension of what's happening in this way that is certainly going to complicate the story moving forward.
Yeah, because you've got several characters already convinced Brandon's going to propose to Eleanor now, including Eleanor's brother.
Yeah.
And they all have different reasons for wanting it to happen. Mm-hmm. But the point is, I think we're supposed to be getting the distinct impression that, like you said, Brandon himself would pause and be like, wait, am I informed correctly? Mm-hmm. But others are just leaping.
They're just like, I saw what I saw, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff with that Brandon stuff in general.
Yeah.
And I suspect, part of what's happening here is we're getting set up to accept what would otherwise feel like a really nonsensical reversal when he and Eleanor do marry in like another 80 pages or something.
Yeah. Or whoever's going to end up with whom.
The other real heat I thought I saw, and I'd be curious to hear what you had to think about this, came just after the revelations about Lucy and Edward.
Right.
Around page 184, 185. It kind of went on for a little while. And
volume 3, she was like, okay, now we're going to swing.
Yeah.
Now we're going to swing for the fences. Yeah. I'm going to tell you something dope.
Well, and I feel like this section where Eleanor breaks the news about Edward to Marianne.
Yeah.
And they talk about it, and you've already alluded to it with Marianne kind of like finally seeing this.
Yeah.
I want to say, and this is a risky thing to say without having finished the book, but I want to say this is the moral backbone of the novel. Like, these might be the 3 most important pages to the novel, and it's basically Eleanor explaining things to Marianne.
Yeah.
And Marianne finally hearing her.
It's on page 186 where the scales really fall from her eyes.
Yeah, it starts right at the bottom of 85.
Yeah.
If such is your way of thinking, says Marianne, if the loss of what is most valued is so easily to be made up by something else, your resolution, your self-command are perhaps a little less to be wondered at. They are brought more within my comprehension. And then it kind of goes on about the middle of 186.
Yeah.
If you can think me capable of ever feeling, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now.
Yes.
The composure of mind with which I have brought myself at present to consider the matter, the consolation that I have been willing to admit, have been the effect of constant and painful exertion. And I kind of feel like this is the pivot. This is the fulcrum.
Well, it's her finally opening up. She's finally opening up to Marianne in a way that the reader knew all this stuff, but Marianne didn't understand it. And maybe Eleanor didn't even... Maybe it's different for Eleanor to have finally put words to it. Yeah, you're right. I think it is a definite fulcrum point.
And then the next paragraph, of course, is I think the one you were kind of referring to, where Marianne has this kind of sudden recognition.
Yeah, look at the lines. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How barbarous I have been to you, you who have been my only comfort, who have borne with me in all my misery, who have seemed to be only suffering for me. Is this my gratitude? Is this the only return I can make you? Because your merit cries out upon myself. I have been trying to do it away." I think that's big. Like in Austen's universe, it seems to me like in our own, a redeeming characteristic is to be able to admit when you were wrong. And
that last line. Let's just take a moment.
Yeah.
The writing there.
Yeah.
There's a scene a little earlier on 166 where we see what I think of as kind of like satirist Jane Austen.
Mm-hmm. Which page?
166.
Oh, right. The business with the mothers and the kids. Yeah.
And right at the top, like the first full paragraph, had both the children been there, the affair might have been determined too easily by measuring them at once. But as Harry only was present, it was all conjectural assertion on both sides, and everybody had a right to be equally positive in their opinion, and to repeat it over and over again as often as they liked.
Yeah.
And I just think, I mentioned, I think last week, that SNL send-up of Jane Austen, when I think it was Keira Knightley hosting, and they were doing this takeaway, and the it was just this parlor with women, singing the praises of a Mr. Willoughby, but it was like awful. Everything was like more and more awful. It was like he buggers the stable boy and smells of urine. Oh, Mr. Willoughby,
right, right.
And I kind of feel like this is that Jane Austen, and great. This is the energy.
Oh yeah, I mean the next sentence, the parties stood thus. Colin, like it reminds me of like the 50 Cent song In the Club.
Yeah.
Like, because the lyrics are so stupid.
Right.
But the music is like
everything
grand and
yeah.
epic, and it's like it could easily be
Why
like
not?
the background music for like I don't know, like some big like war battlefield,
it's some generation's Eye of the Tiger.
Yeah, and yet the lyrics are just like it's just him drinking,
bottle full of bub.
And she's like, the party stood thus, and like what could be coming is like some great moral debate about enclosures,
right?
Based on that mechanic.
But is this dumb thing?
Yes, yes.
And so there's that. But then fast forward 20 pages,
and
we get a line like, "Because your merit cries out upon myself, I have been trying to do it away." I mean, that is just fire.
Yeah.
I mean it's biblical, And I'm sort of like a little in awe of the ability to voice both of these things relatively close together, in this novel of manners that is both about the frivolous and also about the absolute essentials. It's just great.
And it makes me, as far as plot device goes, like I've fastidiously avoided spoilers, and if somehow over the arc of this what's left, Marianne is destined to be crushed or punished in some way, I've considered that as a possibility. That ultimately the avatar of sensibility has to go down. I'm hoping it's not so, and one of the reasons I'm hoping it's not so is because she gives her this kind of language. You can't help but love her for not just saying this but meaning it. And even in the next paragraph, to meet Lucy without betraying the smallest increase of dislike for her, and even to see Edward himself, if chance should bring them together, without any diminution of her usual cordiality. These were great concessions, but where Marianne felt that she had injured, no reparation could be too much for her to make. And I think, that, like, if I were teaching this book and we were talking about characterization as a device, this page that you're emphasizing, these would be like the really good things about Marianne. This would be like, see, we like her. Oh, we like her again. Like, when she hurts somebody, she doesn't, she wants to turn around and make that right. Like, there's nothing that will stop her from doing that. And, that's a good thing about her. It's a good thing about human nature.
Well, she recognizes the scale of this thing, right? I mean, it's not that she sort of mistakenly did one thing.
Right.
Right? I mean, who she was the problem, and now she is committing to change that. Yeah, that's no small feat.
No, and for a 16-year-old or for anybody else. Yeah, for any of us.
So I sort of, as I said, I thought that this was kind of slow going, that it was going to be like some ponders. I mean, Marianne cried for like 30 pages, but man, we get to right to that sort of pivot there in the 180s, and then drift into volume 3 20 pages later. Man, like it got really serious, I think, and really
it did.
I mean, it was it was good throughout.
Yeah.
But I feel like it took on this kind of heat, and I'm curious again. I know I've read earlier. I know I've read other stuff. I believe this is my first go through of Sense and Sensibility. And so I think what I might be doing is sort of placing a little too much weight on the kind of later Austen that I read that maybe has a slightly different feel, but part of this feels a little youthful to me, which I guess it should as a first novel, because it's willing to make these kind of like grand moral pronouncements, but at the same time, I mean, this does not feel naive to me. This feels like somebody in full command of what this means.
I learned on Facebook last week that evidently, though, this is the first that she published, and that's our order of operations. Northanger Abbey, which she published either last or even posthumously. I'm not sure yet. When we get to it, we'll know more. But evidently she wrote that one first.
Oh, I see.
And couldn't get anybody to publish it until either much later after she died. And this is something I want to learn more about.
Okay.
But you're right that Sensibility is her first entry into the public sphere. And, to be honest, there's only 69 pages left, and we've got a couple of weeks. It seems to me that what we're doing is we're setting the stage for finishing and answering all questions at the next volume.
I think that's exactly what we should do next.
Yeah.
I feel like a little logistics. I guess pulling back the curtain some. I feel like I was maybe being a little ambitious and maybe a little flip in saying, that we could kind of get through these 2 episodes at a time.
Yeah.
I think 3 makes more sense.
Yeah.
And I think in some of the later novels, maybe 4.
Some of them are longer than this. Yeah.
And because certainly they read well. They don't have those modest sentences that require so much parsing.
Yeah.
But there's this other freight that I think requires a kind of reflection that I had sort of forgotten about, honestly.
Well, and especially when you consider that suspense and clarification of misunderstanding are 2 very important motifs to Austen.
Yeah.
It feels right that we would have more meetings so that we can be totally wrong at the first one.
Maybe
because it's not, the whole point is you don't know everything, right? And that's a big part of why she remains so beloved, I think, is the way that she slowly doles out more info until finally you're like, oh, so yeah, I like pacing it into 3, and as you say, maybe for a book as big as Mansfield Park, which I remember being a little thicker.
Yeah.
Maybe more.
Right.
So we'll see.
Well, we'll aim for that next time.
Okay. Yeah.